All right, for those of you just joining us on the recording, which will be everybody viewing this because there's nobody else on the call. Welcome to week 16 government seminar. So we'll get underway here in just a minute. All right. Okay, so announcements for week 16. The one that's crossed off there because last night was it. That was last call for Unit 4 test. Only had 3 or 4 people that did not take it, so well done for those that got it done. Unit 5 reading guide is due tomorrow. It's 3 sections. It's not long. It's not arduous. Get it done. You do have until the Monday we come back from break for a last call on that, but don't leave it until the break. You're not going to do it during the break. We both know that. So just get it done now. Get it that way. It's not hanging over your head, or you don't come back Monday and go, "Oh crap, I forgot to do this," and then you slop something together, or worse, you just don't do it. That's just not good. So basically, the last call date on that's a gift. I could have made the last call next Wednesday during the break, but I decided not to do that. So you do have some additional time, but again, just don't get it done now. Biggest thing. Week 16 discussion forum. This is a change from the instructions posted in the course. It will be up through January 4th at 8 a.m. Now, FYI, this is not on the announcement thing, but I just found out about this yesterday. They are planning on taking down Moodle for not very long during the break, but a few hours. I'm not sure when it is. When I get word about it, I will send out a message on Remind, just to let you know that they're running some updates. So just be aware that's happening at some point. I believe it'll be after Christmas is the latest that I've heard. So just be aware that that's coming down the pike, and that after you come back, things may look a little bit different. Don't be thrown. Nothing is fundamentally changing. It just may look a little different than you're used to. Yeah, so be aware of that. But I am keeping the discussion forum open through January 4th at 8 a.m. So if you don't get to participating in the discussion before tomorrow, rest assured you can do that over the break. But again, just be aware they're taking Moodle down at some point during the break. And I will send out a remind about that. If you're not on the remind, number one, shame. Number two, get on the remind. The instructions are in the course. You're missing stuff. You're missing reminders. You're missing urgent announcements. That's where I put them. I don't put them anywhere else. So if you're not on there, you're missing things. Get on the remind. Plain and simple. Either you or your parents, but somebody should join the remind. Make sure you are doing the Unit 5 test. So this is a little bit different than usual. It will go live the Monday we come back from break, and will be due on that Friday. So I know that that's the same, or never mind, that's U.S. history. Yeah. Sorry, my bad. So yeah, just be aware that that is coming down the pike. It's one chapter. It shouldn't. I'm still writing the test because the previous one that I had was based on 3 chapters in the book. I have condensed, so I am condensing the test as well. So that's why it's going to be going live after the break. Holiday extra or seminar work. Make sure you're doing the CNN 10 news quiz and the Week 16 seminar journal. Skipping out on those is just hurting you. You're not. It's not insulting to me. You are not really sticking it to Rosenleaf by not doing my work. If you don't do it, I just give you a 0. Okay, it's your grade. It's your future. Plain and simple. Holiday extra credit goes live or went live yesterday. Will be due on the 24th. Hop on, get that done. It's super easy, and it's 20 points to your grade. Some of you need every point you can get at this point. And the contacting elected representatives extra credit is due on the 8th. Again, if you would like somebody to give your letter a once-over, or, gee, I'm thinking about writing to this person about this topic, do you think that would be appropriate? By all means, email me, text me, send me a message on Remind. Even during the break, I can't promise I'm going to respond instantaneously, but I will get back with you. And that way, if you're just uncertain, especially like with topics, and just so we're making sure that you're not emailing a member of the Montana legislature about the federal budget deficit. They're not going to be able to do anything about that. You know what I mean. Okay, so there you go. And we're still by ourselves. Okay. Okay, so we're talking about federalism today. What is federalism? System of government in which the same territory is controlled by 2 levels of government. Both the national government and the smaller political subdivisions, aka the states, have the power to make laws, and both have a certain level of autonomy from each other. So basically there are things that the federal government's allowed to do, things that only the state governments are allowed to do, things that they are both allowed to do. And then there's how this has been implemented before about 1932 and after 1932 that makes this a very complex system. I mean, it's a 1-chapter unit, but it's pretty vital that you understand this because again, there are things that the national government does, there are things that the state government does. And then there are things that the state governments are supposed to be in charge of that the national government does stuff with. And you go, what the heck? And yeah, basically what the heck. It wouldn't be America if it weren't confusing, would it? Okay, so this is just a graphic organizer I pulled off the Google box. National government, and this is a hardly exhaustive list. This is not complete, but this is a good jumping off point. The national government allowed to declare war. So Montana is not allowed to declare war in Alberta. That would be bad. That would be really, really bad. Maintain an armed force. We're not allowed to have our own armies here in Montana. Now we have a National Guard, but that's actually part of the national military. It's just made up of people from Montana. So that's kind of one of those things that almost starts to kind of straddle the line. Regulate interstate and foreign trade. So Montana cannot tax stuff coming in from Idaho. That would be bad. And we can't tax stuff that we send to Idaho. That would be bad. The states cannot admit new states. Only the national government can do that. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if we could acknowledge new states on the state level? That would just, again, that would be bad. Establish post offices, set standards of weights and measures. Montana does not get to decide what is a pound for itself. That is centralized. Coin money. That was one of those things that before the Constitution, all the states could do. That was something in the Confederate States of America. Each state could coin and print its own money. That was bad. We don't want that. Establish foreign policy. Montana cannot sign a treaty with Japan. That again, that would be bad. I keep saying that, but it's really true. It would be bad. Make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out delegated powers. We're going to talk about that one by itself here in a little bit. On the state level, states can establish and maintain schools. The exception to that is, well, number one, Department of Defense. Now, not here. We have an Air Force base, and the kids on the base come to our schools here in Great Falls. But in many places, bases have their own schools. So, yeah, the states do this, but there are some circumstances where it is something the national government can do. Not frequently, but again, things like that. The other thing is that, of course, the federal government provides a ton of money to support public schools, including special education is a federal mandate. It is not something that, the states got together and decided, oh, we're all individually going to have special ed. No, it is a federal program. Federal money is thrown into it. And we're going to talk more about this notion of the federal government sort of getting involved in stuff that the states are supposed to be in charge of. Establish local governments. And I'm going to do a separate slide about this, but local governments are considered subsections of the state governments. So it's not like three-layer federalism where the locals are as important as the states, as important as the federal. No. Local government is totally subordinate to state government, entirely 110%. Without the state government, the local governments wouldn't exist. Make marriage laws. So the states get to determine who can get married. Nowadays, that's a function. One of the big issues is, of course, gay marriage. In the 1960s, we were talking, there were states that had laws that said that, people of two different races couldn't get married. Some states had laws that said that a woman could get married at like age 13 without parental consent. That was mainly in the South. The rock and roll legend Jerry Lee Lewis married his really inappropriate cousin when she was like 13 or 14 or something like that, and they had to drive across state lines into I forget what state to make that happen. So marriage laws provide for public safety. Now, the federal government also has some hand in that with like the FBI and whatnot, but the primary responsibility for public safety on a day in, day out basis is, of course, the state and through the state, local governments. Assume other powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states. And that's written into the Constitution. Basically, if it's not laid out in the Constitution that the national government gets to do it, it's something that the state governments get to do. But that sort of runs into that necessary and proper thing that we're going to talk about here in a minute. And then there are things that both levels are allowed to do. Maintain law and order. And that kind of goes back to, provide for public safety, but both the national government sometimes steps in to take care of law and order if the states can't or won't. Levy taxes. If you are somebody that has a job, you know that you have to file taxes every year. Maybe you haven't had to yet. Maybe you do that with your parents. But like I had to file taxes last year and I got money back from the federal government and I had to pay the state $100. So yeah, they're different. They're not the same. Borrow money. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. States are not allowed to, for the most part, run deficits. They have to balance their budgets. They can have surpluses, but they can't have deficits. They can't owe more money than they take in, or spend more money than they take in. The national government can spend more than it takes in every year. Year after year after year after year after year. They can do that. If the states could do that, we'd probably be in really bad trouble. Charter banks, both are allowed to do that. Established courts, there are two court systems, well, 50 plus court systems in the United States, 51 plus court systems, because of course each state has courts and then the national government has courts. Provide for the public welfare. There you go. So that's just a quick breakdown, and this will be in the document that I post. I post a static document of these slides, so you can look at that if you want to. I'm sure there's probably this chart in your book as well, or something like it. Okay, so when we talk about federalism, before about 1932, the model that most people dealt with was a very strict separation of what the national government does and what the state government does, and that was called layer cake federalism. So there were very clear delineations of who did what. Okay? The national government did these things, the state government did these things, and never the two shall mix. Right? That was prior, again, to about 1932. 1932, well, really 1933, rolls around, and the U.S. is in the midst of the Great Depression, and a new president comes to power, one Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, via the New Deal, is going to sort of change the way that the federal government interacts with the state governments and interacts with its own people. And the federal government is suddenly in charge of a lot of things that up to that point were really kind of state-only things, direct relief for people and finding jobs for people and things like that. And ever since then, the lines between federal and state have gotten a lot more blurry. It's kind of like when we were talking about education before. Yeah, states set up schools, but the national government provides lots and lots of money, and as such, they can make demands upon that money. If you want to get this money, then you need to do these things. Better example would be highways. So, and I noticed we did actually add somebody. Welcome, Josephina. I don't know if you probably don't remember this because I think it ended before you were born, maybe, or shortly thereafter. But Montana used to not have an actual speed limit on its highways. The Montana speed limit was listed as whatever is reasonable and prudent for the road conditions. And that was how it was from about the beginning of the automobile until about the 1970s. And during the 1970s, in response to the gas crisis, the oil crisis, the national government was trying to encourage people to be more fuel efficient and not to expend as much fuel. One of the ways they could do that was trying to get everybody to drive slower. And the cars are more efficient when they're driven at 65 miles an hour than when they're driven at 80, 90, 95 miles an hour. So the federal government said, we want everybody to drive at 65. And the states were like, no, we're not lowering our speed limits because that would be incredibly unpopular. So the national government said, fine, here's a bunch of money. If you want the money, you're going to lower your speed limit to 65. And pretty much all the states said, yeah, we need that money. Because especially in states like Montana, we have tons of highways. There is no way we could maintain our highways without federal funding. Absolutely. I mean, it would be like the streets of Black Eagle across, and not Smelter, they redid Smelter recently, but drive the back streets of Black Eagle sometime, and you will know, potholes, and drive down 22nd Street in Black Eagle is where I used to live, and oh my gosh, it's like, and all of Montana's roads would be like that if Montana was in charge of maintaining our roads. We just don't have enough money. We have really cold winters and lots of weather, and potholes and cracks and whatnot emerge. So with federal support, all of our highways get taken care of so they're not huge piles of crap, right? But the federal government tied certain things to that. Another thing they tied to that was drinking age. There was a time that, and actually states are the ones that set drinking age, but the federal government has long tied some of that highway money to a state having a 21 as their minimum drinking age. Some states decided to forego that money and go down to 18, and their state budgets were crippled because they were having to come up with more highway funding. So ultimately, I think it was Louisiana tried to kind of buck the national government on that, and they had to reverse it because they're like, yeah, we're broke. We can't do this. So yeah, that's how cooperative federalism largely is now sort of integrated, is via federal government pouring money on things and making conditions that tie that money to certain actions that states have to take. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what that is. So what about local governments? Again, they are not considered equal to state governments and federal governments. They are basically, without the states, local governments wouldn't exist. So yeah, it's not 3-level federalism, it's 2-level federalism. Okay, so how does the federal government go about getting its hands in stuff that it otherwise wouldn't be able to get its hands in? Number one is a clause in the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause. This is also sometimes called the Elastic Clause. And this is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the U.S. Constitution. And this is really the biggie for federal action in areas that otherwise you're like, wait a minute, that should be a state thing. Yeah, no, they're allowed to do it. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. What does necessary and proper mean? Therein lies how the national government is allowed to set education policy and do all sorts of other things, because they will say, well, this is necessary and proper for us doing our job. And part of what Congress is allowed to make laws for is protecting the public welfare. And so there you go. That's necessary and proper becomes a pretty gray area. The first case where this was upheld was McCulloch versus Maryland. This was a case about the second Bank of the United States. So if you remember back to U.S. history days, we had a Bank of the United States set up by Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson killed it. Thomas Jefferson said, we don't need no stinking banks. And so Jefferson basically 86'd it. And after the War of 1812, even Jefferson's shadow, James Madison, said, we need a bank, because fighting this war without a bank sucked. So Madison helps establish the second Bank of the United States, and Maryland, among other states, was like, we don't think this bank should exist. The federal government's not allowed to create banks. It is not written in the Constitution that they're allowed to do that, by gum. It's malarkey. So Maryland attempted to put a tax on the second Bank of the United States in Maryland, where there was a branch. And it was such a high tax, it only applied to out-of-state banks, and there was only one out-of-state bank in Maryland, the second Bank of the United States. And Maryland basically tried to tax the bank to the point where the bank couldn't stay in business. So this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules against Maryland. Congress may not have the explicit power to create a bank, but it has the implied power to do so, so that Congress can fulfill its taxation and spending powers. So again, necessary and proper. It is necessary and proper for the national government to establish a bank. And it's not okay for states to tax entities of the federal government, the same way it's not okay for the federal government to tax entities of the states. Again, they don't get to tax each other because they could tax each other out of existence. Necessary and proper is often taken to mean convenient and useful, and that's how Congress basically gets its hands in all sorts of stuff. Okay, the second one that helps do this, the Commerce Clause. And that one says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. And so this has been used to anything that might in some way touch on trade between the states, or between the states and the federal government, or again between the states and Native American tribes. Congress has the right to make law about it. The case that really helped to firmly establish this was Gibbons versus Ogden, where the Supreme Court said that Congress was the only one that got to regulate trade between the states. Basically, New York granted a guy the charter to run a steamboat line between New York and New Jersey. New Jersey granted another guy the sole right to do that, and they conflicted and they sued each other, and the Supreme Court said, hey, neither one of you has the sole right to do that. Only the federal government, only Congress can grant that charter. You know, so New York, New Jersey, thanks for playing, but yeah, you're not allowed to do that. So the Commerce Clause is used to justify federal action in lots of ways. Drug policy. One of the reasons they can do that is because most drugs go over state lines. You know, they're being imported with the exception of meth. Although meth, that's another thing. They've created federal crimes that make meth distribution a crime. But for the most part, drugs are coming across state lines. So it's a federal crime. Like 70% of crimes in the federal system are drug crimes. It's ridiculous, the amount of drug cases in the federal judiciary. Federal civil rights laws. One of the first ways that the government was able to get involved in this was because like bus lines went across state lines. And so if bus terminals were segregated, that was a federal issue. That was not a state issue, that was a federal issue. Healthcare laws, healthcare policy, because people go across state lines to get healthcare. Insurance is sold by companies that operate in other states. Interstate highways, that one's fairly obvious. Constructing hydroelectric dams. Again, the commerce power is what enables them to do that. And then finally, the Supremacy Clause, which says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. This is a very fancy and flowery way of saying the feds win. When the feds and the states come into conflict, 99 times out of 100, the federal government's going to win. And this is Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution. Without this is often called the linchpin of the Constitution. Without this, it would be a mess, because the state governments would constantly be fighting with the federal government about stuff. Not that they're not already fighting with the federal government about stuff, but it's kind of a fruitless battle because ultimately the feds win. So this is just a lovely visual representation. The U.S. Constitution is on the top rung of the ladder, federal laws and treaties, then state constitutions, then state laws, then local laws. Local laws are basically everybody's B word. So again, linchpin of the Constitution. Without this, everything would fall apart. This is basically umpired by the Supreme Court of the United States. Cases that involved the Supremacy Clause. Ware versus Hilton, which was 1796. First time the Supreme Court had applied the Supremacy Clause to strike down a state statute. Virginia had passed a law during the Revolutionary War allowing the state to confiscate debt payments by Virginia citizens to British creditors, basically keeping that money from going to British creditors. The Supreme Court found that the Virginia statute was inconsistent with the Treaty of Paris, where the rights of British creditors were protected. Basically, people that were in Britain who were owed money were allowed to recoup that money in the United States if it was owed to British creditors. So they struck down that Virginia law. Marbury versus Madison, which found that Congress cannot pass laws that are contrary to the Constitution, and is the role of the judicial system to interpret what the Constitution permits. The court found Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional to the extent that it tried to enlarge the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court beyond that permitted by the Constitution. Martin v. Hunter's Lessee and Cohen's v. Virginia were both about state court decisions involving Constitution laws of the United States. Where was it? I have it in my notes here. Gives the Supreme Court the ultimate power to review state court decisions involving Constitution and laws. Supreme Court has final say in matters involving federal law, including constitutional interpretation, can overrule decisions by state courts. And then finally, McCullough versus Maryland that we already talked about. Supreme Court reviewed a tax levied by Maryland on the federally incorporated Bank of the United States, found that if a state had the power to tax a federally incorporated institution, then the state effectively had the power to destroy the federal institution, thereby thwarting the intent and purposes of Congress. This would make the states superior to the federal government. The Supreme Court found that this would be inconsistent with the Supremacy Clause. So there you go. That's just 4 examples. There are numerous examples where the Supreme Court has had to step in and say, nope, federal government's the boss. All right, so that was fast and dirty about federalism. So your journal topic, do you think the federal government overuses the elastic clause and the commerce clause to get into too many issues it should not be involved in? Why or why not? So any questions about anything we talked about today? All right. If there are no questions, I am going to allow you to be free. If you have something you need to talk to me about, hang out, and we will discuss it. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye.